Good morning, Indonesia, Southeast Asia, and the world.
So happy to be here as you start your day.
Do you remember the bend
And snap!
Oh my God.
And that concludes the See Today updates for today. We'll return for information at 4 o'clock on the 3-hour news show.
Welcome back to See the Stories.
Now time for See Today Business with me, Kaisuria.
Come see the beauty, only on See Indonesia.
Dari Madrid, saya stay 1 malam, terus besok paginya saya naik kereta ke Granada. Eventnya diselenggarakan di Granada, Spain.
Sebelumnya saya memang sudah hampir 6-7 bulan latihan. Mudah-mudahan saya bisa selesai dengan baik. Itu harapan saya.
Kita berjumpa lagi di konten ngobrolin tentang Nusantara.
Spot C kedatangan very special VIP guest today.
Kan udah ditanya juga di situ.
Ya kan ini kan beda acaranya.
Back to the topic, guys.
Rakyat Merdeka adalah media yang memberitakan peristiwa politik dan sosial sejak awal era reformasi. Dan Rakyat Merdeka konsisten berani tampil beda dengan bahasa yang mudah dimengerti.
Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. Now we are entering the 6th session of today's town hall, titled Moving the Global Financial Reform Forward, Make It Work for the Global South. However, before we begin, let's tune in to a message from Senator the Honorable Simon Birmingham, Shadow Minister for Foreign Affairs for Australia. The Honorable Birmingham, you may have the screen.
Thanks for this opportunity to provide a brief message into this year's Global Town Hall. And particular thanks to Dino and Michael from Global Citizen for giving me this opportunity at a time when messy world is sadly a grave reality. More than ever, we see a world in which the toll of innocent lives being lost across multiple conflicts and humanitarian crises right around the world is growing every day. Some of these crises dominate our headlines. There's the continuing impact of Russia's illegal and immoral invasion of Ukraine, which recently passed its second anniversary. There's the devastating ramifications of Hamas's terrorist attack on Israel, approaching its first anniversary on October the 7th. Many factors will influence why some conflicts gain more attention than others. However, as global citizens, your perspective should be wide and inclusive. Less than 4 years ago, democratic Myanmar fell to a brutal military coup, which saw the imprisonment and murder of its own citizens and their suffering that has gone on for so long, continuing in even greater form. Large death tolls and millions of people have been displaced across Sudan, and war continues to rage. Iran and Afghanistan are ever increasing their repression of women and girls. This year marks 2 years since the murder of Mahsa Amini. Also 2 years ago, the UN Human Rights Office concluded that China is responsible for committing humanity crimes against the Uyghur minority in Xinjiang region. As a strong, proud liberal democracy, Australians stand by our values in defence of freedoms and liberties with strong conviction for human rights. And it's with great dismay that we see the same freedoms and rights not granted nor enjoyed by others around the world. It's for these reasons, among many others, that Australia, a founding member of the United Nations, has long been an advocate and a most active participant in multilateral institutions, treaties and cooperation. However, as the world has surged towards a more complex time, a messier time, it brings into question whether our current systems are still working. Even in the absence of those areas of hot conflict that I discussed before, we see the risk profile increasing here in our own region in the Indo-Pacific, threatening our region's status as a place of freedom and prosperity. This increased risk is evident in the destruction of democracy and civil liberties in Hong Kong, the escalation of ambitions to so-called reunify China, with consequent pressure on Taiwan and on all those who engage with Taiwan. There's the rapid build-up of the PRC's military size, capabilities and bases, including in locations beyond China. And there are increasing tensions involving territorial disputes between China and nations such as the Philippines or India. All of this, left unchecked, risks regional trade routes being controlled by one superpower, other nations finding their sovereignty compromised, or international rules and norms being rewritten by autocracies or non-market economies to the ultimate detriment of all. This does not mean that Australia, in our drive for a free and open region, seeks to contain China. Indeed, China's economic growth is welcome. It's essential to continue to lift people out of poverty. And China's engagement in world affairs should equally be welcomed. But it is reasonable that we expect China to contribute in such a way that does not undermine peace, stability, and the rules-based order. The sovereignty of all nations should be respected, protected, and upheld by each other, with respect for each other. The avoidance of conflict now depends upon both deterrence and diplomacy, working hand in hand to secure peace and stability. All of these conflicts, these crises, these tensions sit in a world where climate change and technological upheaval add to the uncertainty, while placing even greater demands on multilateral cooperation. So as I draw my remarks to a close, I pose some questions to you, our global citizens. Are the systems on which multilateralism has been built still fit for purpose? Do our international systems work as effectively as they might to secure peace, security, and prosperity? Are they not failing at the most basic and important task, which is to prevent war? You, as global citizens meeting in this global town hall, are uniquely placed to debate what steps should be taken to fix these failures. Our world will always be complex and messy, But we must reverse the trends that risk disaster and great disruption if left unchecked. I wish you well in your discussions, and as always, I look forward to hearing the outcomes and the thoughts of Global Citizen. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Honorable Birmingham. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to invite the moderator for this session, CEO of EIB Network and Chairman of Empire Group, Bola Ray. Bola Ray, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Kiara, and a good job there. Hello, everyone, and you're most welcome to Global Town Hall 2024. My name is Nat Kwabinadisi, popularly known as Bola Ray, CEO of EIB Network and Empire Ghana, right here in Ghana. And in Ghana, we say Akwaba, that is for welcome. As your moderator for this incredible journey through the minds of global leaders and thinkers, we're gathered here today, virtually, but united. And of course, it's going to be a full day of stimulating discussions on the issues that matter most to us all. Last year, over 20,000 of you from 140 countries joined us for this unique forum. This year, we're building on that momentum, aiming to reach even wider, to hear even more voices, and to ignite more conversations. The Global Town Hall is a platform for open dialogue, a space where we can engage in critical thinking and explore diverse perspectives on the state of the world in 2024. We'll be diving deep into geopolitical trends and issues, examining the world economy, and discussing the urgency of climate change and tackling other pressing global challenges. Our speakers, I must say, are some of the brightest minds on the planet, leaders in their fields, and rightly so. They're ready to share their insights and engage in honest, insightful conversations. But this isn't just about listening. This is about participating. This is your chance to ask all the relevant questions, share your own thoughts, and be a part of global dialogue. Well, I urge you to take action by using the QR code on your screen. We'll have 2 rounds of moderated Q&A, ensuring your voices are heard. So you know what? Get ready to engage, ask all the tough questions, and be a part of this critical discussion. Together, we can build a brighter future. So we're going to begin with our first speaker, who is a former Minister of Finance in Indonesia from 2013 to 2014, Dr. Hatib Basri. Good morning, Doc, and a pleasure to have you. My question will be, in the light of economic challenges faced by developing countries due to COVID-19 pandemic, how can financial reforms supported by the Pandemic Fund contribute to the rebuilding economic stability and resilience in these regions? And if I should add quickly, what specific financial efforts or reforms should be prioritized to ensure a robust recovery and address the widening economic disparities caused by the pandemic? Dr. Hatib.
Can you hear me?
Loud and clear, sir.
Okay, thank you very much. Thanks for this opportunity. But before I respond to your question, I think it is important to understand that this COVID-19 pandemic left us with a scarring effect. Yeah, for many emerging developing economies, we are facing a problem like probably in the case of ASEAN countries, only probably around 27% of the population in ASEAN did not get an access for the online education during the pandemic because the issue of this, the digital divide. So there is a risk of the learning loss. We also learned that the widening gender gap, because the sector that affected very much during the pandemic was informal sector, in which women and children are working in these sectors. The other issue is we are facing the problem of what I call the K-shaped recovery, because the group of some group of people who has an access for the digital and also was able to stay at home because they had enough savings at the time, their savings continue to increase. But if you're talking about the lower middle income group, they were affected very much. Yeah, with this kind of background, the design of the fiscal policy definitely need to be inclusive. But the problem is for the emerging developing economies, we are facing the issue, at least in the last 3 years, about the relatively high interest rate. It means that there is a limited space for the fiscal to be expanded because the cost of fund is very expensive. And unfortunately, when we established the so-called the Bretton Woods institution, the Bretton Woods institution was not designed to address this multifaceted crisis. It was designed to address the issue of the some particular, the issue of the financial sector. But we are facing now is a multifaceted crisis. It's a problem of the climate issue. It's a problem of geopolitical tension and also health issue. That is why there is a need for us to review again whether this current existing institution is strong enough to support the emerging developing economy, especially because there is a risk of what I call the K-shaped recovery. So under this kind of situation, let me talk a little bit in more detail. The challenge for us, we are in the situation we desperately need a multilateral cooperation. But what we're facing today now is a geofragmentation due to the geopolitical tension. Yeah, in economic perspective, in the past, when we decided to make an investment, it's always based on the issue of the efficiency, comparative advantage. That's why we decide about the offshoring. But nowadays, the economic security become the top priority. When we are talking about the inventory method, it's no longer about just in time, but just in case. Yeah, so many countries all over the world started to put the economic security as the top priority. Then we learn about the so-called the friendshoring, etc. But emerging developing economies, this is not going to be easy because their access for the financial sector will be very limited. Now, let me talk about two issues. The experience on the issue of the pandemic, since I'm sitting as a co-chair of the pandemic fund, and also I'm sitting in the couple of board of the climate issue. We do understand those two issues as very important, and we need a lot of money related to that. But I think the existing Bretton Woods institution is not ready for that. So that is why, if I may share my view regarding those two issues, what we need in the future is what I call the integrated financial scheme. Yeah, definitely each country, in terms of pandemic, the health issue, or the climate issue, they need to provide the so-called the domestic resource mobilization. Definitely, they need to put the money on that. But unfortunately, these domestic resources is not unlimited. It is limited. The fiscal space is limited. So that is why there is also a need to cooperation with multilateral agency. I understand that, like the IMF has already provided the SDR, to help to support for the issue of the climate, for example, but that's not enough. I think the Multilateral Development Bank should also expand the so-called the concession loan. And there is a need for the member countries to put up additional capital. But this is easier to be said than done because there is some issues regarding the veto, the reform in the Bretton Woods. In addition to that, in order, I do understand that the amount of money is also limited, even from the multilateral agency. So we need to invite the participation from the private sector, the philanthropy. And one way to do it is to come up with the issue of the innovative financing. This is just an example, I'm talking maybe being too specific, but my point is, let me conclude my remarks by sharing about what Indonesia did during the G20 22, that's 2 years ago. Indonesia was in a very difficult situation at that time because it was not easy to came up with the leaders' declaration due to the tension between US, the Western countries, and also Russia at that time. So the idea is try to find an area in which that everybody around the table will agree to sit together. So that is why the health issue, the pandemic fund, become a crucial issue, become a very important deliberation, because when you talk about the pandemic, when you talk about the health, everybody around the table will agree to sit together.
And Doc, that is a very good one on the pandemic fund. I want to spend a minute with you on that in just a minute, because you've mentioned integrated financial skills on the multilateral, scope. Additionally, how could the pandemic fund enhance pandemic preparedness and response? You've made some brilliant, insightful, submissions, while we're also promoting sustainable economic growth in low and middle income countries. In a minute.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Well, we learned from the pandemic, when the health system collapsed, the economy collapsed. So definitely we have to see the health issue as an investment rather than spending. And then one thing that we learned during the pandemic was the financing for pandemic was silo, ill-equipped, inadequate. So that is why it is important to allocate funding, dedicated fund for pandemic prevention, preparedness, and response. By doing this, we can prevent the disaster's impact to the human life, to the economic. So for example, like last night, we just had the pandemic fund meeting to anticipate about what happened in African countries regarding the Mpox, for example. So if we can do something in order to pandemic prevention preparedness in terms of to provide in 3 areas: workforce, surveillance, and also laboratory, this could save a lot of money and also lives. So this is the thing that we are working on. We have managed to have this, to be able in the last 2 years, $2 billion money, but this is far from enough. That
Fantastic.
is my commitment.
Fantastic. Excellent submission there. Thank you very much, Dr. Mohammed Habib Basri. Great submission. And I would want to now move on to Madam Maria Elena Aguero. Once again, you're most welcome, Madam. And she is the Secretary General of Club de Madrid. And we're happy to have you in this global town hall. I want to know from you, Madam Maria, Club de Madrid is heavily involved in the push for meaningful and actionable reforms to global financial institutions, including the creation of Impact Coalition on International Financial Architecture Reform and Financing for Development. As we have an entire session later on the UN Summit of the Future, we might try to avoid, too much talk surrounding the summit. However, my question is, how will this coalition focus on areas of reform such as multilateral financing, development measurements, and sovereign debts? Madam Maria.
So I'll unmute myself. Here I am. Thank you all very much. Thank you to FPCI and thank you to the moderator, Mr. Ray, and Dr. Shahid. This was very, very interesting, and you've addressed many of the points regarding the reform. Now, as you say, the Club of Madrid is actively advocating for meaningful reforms in the global financial institutions, and one of the ways we're doing this is through the Impact Coalition and the work that we're doing with civil society and on these issues. Now, let me explain a little bit why the Club of Madrid is involved and advocating for these reforms. And this is, first of all, because of who and what the Club of Madrid is. The Club of Madrid is the world's largest forum of democratic former presidents and prime ministers from around the world. We have 124 members from 72 countries. And the mission is to leverage their individual and collective leadership experience and global reach in order to strengthen more inclusive democratic practice and improve the well-being of people around the world. And this at the local, national, regional, and global level. So in our strategic programming, the concept and the objective of effective multilateralism and global cooperation is one of our major pillars or priority areas of work. Now, we know that in the year 2020, in 2020, on the 75th anniversary of the UN Secretary General issued a very ambitious call to improve international cooperation through effective multilateralism at a time when we were facing very, very complex challenges, many of which have been referred to by Dr. Jadib in the previous intervention, and the complexity of major interconnected and converging challenges. Now, this call to action was summarized in the Our Common Agenda report of 2021. Following that, and because there was a common thread throughout this report and its recommendations that in order to effectively deliver global public goods and inclusive economic development, a central objective of effective multilateralism had to be governance arrangements. It had to be the governance arrangements of international institutions that on the one hand needed to be strengthened and in many cases reformed, because as we know, they were created many decades ago and are not necessarily fit for purpose to address today's challenges. Now, in response to a request from the General Assembly, the Secretary General announced the formation of a high-level advisory board on effective multilateralism that was tasked with developing an independent reform in support of this objective and to build on the Our Common Agenda report on those recommendations and make more concrete suggestions on more effective multilateral arrangements across a range of global issues. We've got to remember that this was all in COVID mode because we were right in the middle of the pandemic at the time. So it was as we all know, it was a moment of very complex converging crises. But all of this was aimed to have these very concrete suggestions and proposals and recommendations for the Summit of the Future, which had originally been scheduled for last year and was postponed and will be taking place in just a few short weeks, in the time of the high-level week of the UN General Assembly. Now, with effective multilateralism and global cooperation as one of the main pillars of our strategic work as Club de Madrid, with three of the Club de Madrid members as part of the high-level advisory board on effective multilateralism, the two co-chairs, Stefan Levin and Ellen Johnson-Sirleaf, and Club de Madrid President Turk, it's only natural then for the Club de Madrid to focus much of our recent work on the main issues of concern and in pursuit of more effective multilateralism, and the issue of the necessary strengthening and or reform of the international financial institutions, and not only of the Bretton Woods institutions, but of the international financial institutions more broadly, the regional development banks and other organizations in the financial sector. It is important, and because they are key vehicles for the delivery of those public goods that are necessary to achieve inclusive economic development. Now, why is the reform? Yeah.
Again, interesting submissions, but just in addition, I want us to lump it together. What actions do we need to take in order to see the governance of international financial institutions reformed? Madam Arrero.
This is, well, it's the actions that need to be taken. I think if we look at them, there are different levels. They're at the level of representation and of participation in the international financial institutions. And we often speak of having a seat at the table. Now, this is translated in increased participation for those countries that are underrepresented, that are present, or groups that are underrepresented within the international financial institutions, as a way of amplifying their voice and their representation. The other is another issue or another challenge is the agility, the speed with which the international financial institutions are able to respond, to adapt and to respond to this complex global challenges. Now, this speed has to be both in the sense of the outflows in terms of and this relates to the debt and the interest payments on debts, the outflow of resources. It also means in terms of the accessing of resources, the way that resources can be brought to, especially to the developing countries, as these resources are needed to face the challenges, and then adapting to respond to the global challenges, as I was saying earlier. Now, in terms of the scale, it's necessary, absolutely necessary, to increase the scale of funding available, both in the multilateral development institutions, in the international financial institutions, the multilateral development banks, so that they can make the funding available to ensure that the developing countries can meet their climate goals, meet the sustainable development goals. We've got to remember that this is also a commitment to which we have all signed up in 2015, and the time is approaching to meet that 2030 agenda and the Sustainable Development Goals, and
Indeed.
also to address the ongoing debt crisis, which is a debt crisis, but also a development crisis, because the debt hinders, hampers development. The other issue is the sustainability of all of this. Now, the debt sustainability is absolutely central to the international financial architecture and to its reform. It includes reducing the debt and the debt service burden, improving the lending rates, and enhancing the transparency of the financing instruments and processes.
Thank you very much, Madam Awero. I think that you've captured the salient points for us and excellently delivered. We'd like to say a very big thank you to you, for your insights. As we move on to David McNair. David is the Executive Director for Global Policy of One Campaign. And we're happy to have you in this room, David, and this global town hall. Now, my question to you, David, will be, there are multiple calls for global financial architecture reform, such as the Barbadian Prime Minister Mia Mottley's Bridgetown Initiative. I can also talk about the Vulnerable 20 or V20 Group's April 2023 proposal within the African Union Summit, the Egypt-led Sustainable Debt Coalition in COP27, and many more. Mr. McNair, we want to know from you, what is your assessment of these initiatives and their ability to move IFIs to and decision makers? What is your point? Do we need a more unified effort in reforming the global financial architecture? Your thoughts, Mr. McNair.
Thank you, Bulla. And I want to pick up on a few points that Maria and Dr. Habib have made. It's clear that our financial system needs reform. And I want to start with one example. More than 1 in 3 people on the planet live in countries that spend more on servicing their debt than on health and education. And as we've seen in Sri Lanka, when countries default on their debt, it can cause major social and political crises. And there's so many more countries that are at high risk of debt distress. And what that means is that their governments can't afford to service their debt payments that they've taken on to fund roads and bridges and hospitals, but they also can't make the urgent investments in building resilience to pandemics, as Dr. Hadib has mentioned, and building resilience to climate change and transitioning their energy systems. Now, debt is not a bad thing. In fact, it's an essential part of modern life. People take on debt to fund and invest in a home, in their education, in their future. But when it becomes too expensive, it is unsustainable. And this is where I want to get to your question. What's happened in the past few years is that in the wake of COVID and Russia's invasion of Ukraine, energy and food inflation increased in advanced countries. So the Federal Reserve put up interest rates. And because most debt around the globe is priced in US dollars, the cost of debt for emerging economies increased dramatically. And because countries that were affected by that decision had no say over it, that's a major problem. And in fact, the US Federal Reserve has no mandate to even consider the impact on those countries. We're talking about hundreds of countries and billions of people. So what we need is a system that's more representative to fully take into account the impacts of those decisions on everyone. And that's where initiatives like the Bridgetown Initiative and works by groups like the One Campaign and Global Citizen are so important. The world is changing so fast. And while 20 years ago, I think the G20 was the place where these decisions could be made, we're now living in a world of power and geopolitical fragmentation. And there's no one place where these decisions can be kind of taken forward. So what's happening with these coalitions is that they're bringing together governments and activists and researchers to champion these reforms that benefit our people and our planet. And they're taking every opportunity they can find to push forward these decisions at the G7, at the G20, at the African Union, at the UN, and lots more places. But the challenge is that those countries that have power over these decisions are looking inward, and they're consumed by conflict and the geopolitical tensions that we've talked about. And that's where we need activists like all of you listening, because to make sure that these issues are at the top of minds of political leaders, we need people to be raising their voices, because ultimately politicians work for the people, or at least they should. And it may seem that these issues are distant or complex, or that you're powerless to change them. But the truth is, and I've seen this again and again, activists can make a real difference by writing to your government, by raising your voice on your channels and in the media, by showing politicians that their citizens care about these issues. So we need championing for reform of the debt architecture. We need at least $3 trillion a year for the energy transition and for development. We need unlocking of special drawing rights. We need to really address this issue of expensive debt and the cost of capital and the credit rating agencies. But we can only do that with the political capital that activists bring to the table. And that's where all of you listening matter so much.
And your take on this, I want to also bring this in. Leading think tanks such as the Center for Global Development, also the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, Atlantic Council, you mentioned the Bretton Woods institutions or committee, as well as CSOs like Fridays for Future and Extinction Rebellion. They've launched studies and initiatives on global governance and multilateral reform. David, your thoughts. What role do you think these think tanks play and CSOs they play in this reform? How can they best leverage their impact?
Well, I think governments are consumed. They're consumed by crises, by whatever's happening in the media. And we really need researchers and thought leaders and civil society to be putting ideas on the agenda. And actually, Dr. Habib talked about the Indonesian G20. One of the key aspects of that G20 was putting on the agenda this idea of multilateral development bank reform, bringing together groups like Center for Global Development and the One Campaign to kind of identify specific actionable agendas that could be taken forward, and then building political coalitions around that. And I think it's so important that we put together these ideas on reducing the cost of capital, on getting the money flowing from multilateral development banks, reducing the debt crises. But the key thing is that none of these ideas are going to fly unless the governments are feeling political heat to act on them. And that's where activists really, really matter. Because if you're a government leader, you're consumed by whatever's happening. And unless you're hearing people in the street, people on social media, people in traditional media saying this stuff is important, you're not going to prioritize it. And we need this to be prioritized right across the G20. And that's why activist voices matter so much.
Aptly captured, David. Fantastic. Thank you very much. And activism is the word that I picked from you, that we need to be out there and advocate for it and really, champion that cause. So thank you. I'll now move on to Ronan Palmer. Ronan is the Chief Economist of E3G. So I'm moving on to our next speaker, Ronan. And Ronan, my question is very simple. I want to know from you, and it borders on climate change. We know it's a pressure that will inevitably be felt by the entire global population, and will require a holistic response from international financial institutions to mitigate this. Is the global north addressing this need through financial institution reform effectively? And how can the global south be supported in transitioning a clean economy in order to build climate resilience while also addressing the current economic challenges? It's a tough one, but I know Ronan will help us. Let's have your thoughts on this, Ronan.
Well, yes, a very simple question. Thank you, Bill. I always appreciate a simple question early in the morning here in Ireland. I think what you're asking me kind of really digs into the political economy changes that we need here. Now, we know that countries are already, all around the world, already pressured by climate change. And even if we stop all carbon emissions tomorrow, it's not going to get better quickly. The crisis is here. Countries are already feeling it. There's good news. I always like to think that there's good news because the economics of cleaner technology and that's all moving very nicely. The renewable power is getting cheaper. Batteries are getting better and all of that. So we know the possibilities are here. But what else have we seen in terms of the underlying politics over the last while? We have seen the European Green Deal and the Inflation Reduction Act in the States speed up the change in global north very nicely, thank you, because global north countries have the capacities to put that money in. And we've also seen global north countries flirting more than flirting with protectionist policies. And we've also seen, perhaps coming out of the economic orthodoxy or the post-global financial crisis, this great austerity, which is meaning the kind of real cuts to development assistance and a real hesitation or delays in getting money, like the collective quantified goal for climate change actually being delivered? So the truth is, are there ways of helping everybody, and particularly helping the emerging markets and developing economies, to prosper in this clean economy that we all hope is coming? Well, the first thing is something that everybody has kind of said already: climate finance, all development finance, debt relief need to be stepped up if countries are to get the grant assistance and to be able to get the borrowing that they need for development. Now, I said I'd mention political economy. Bear in mind, there are some really challenging things in that. It's one thing getting the institutions to move. You also need to get the mindsets to move. And I think this really goes back to David's point about how do you persuade the mindsets to move. Issues like global taxation, and we have great work being done at UN at the moment in driving this forward. Unless countries can raise funding without a fear of capital flight, they really, we really do face challenges ahead. And where we have seen a country try to do this almost by itself, as in Kenya, the people respond, and they respond negatively. There really needs to be something that can enable the kind of global taxation initiatives that Brazil's G20 and others have been taking forward. That's absolutely essential within this. It also means that the kind of gut feel of so many economists and economy ministers, and forgive me, Dr. Basri, as a former economy minister, this may not be true of Indonesia, but you know that so many of your colleagues in Global North will reach immediately for the expenditure cuts and not raise anything about taxes, and austerity will govern as has happened before and may happen again. And we're already seeing it in a post-COVID world in Global North. So we can ask for this money all we like, but unless those kind of core political economy changes happen, then I think we will still be struggling. We will still be bouncing along the bottom here.
Right. Well, thank you very much, Ronald Palmer. And we want to welcome Etsi Negash Kebret, Development Finance Advisor, the Development Reimagined, our next speaker. And you might want to take it away from here. Thank you.
Sorry, Bola, can you repeat the question? My apologies.
I want to come through with a question for you, Etsi, and it's about the amount of financing available from global financial institutions. We all know, we say that it's not adequate enough to meaningfully address and, reduce global disparity. What 2 or top or 3 reforms will you suggest that will ensure a more equitable distribution of financing to African nations? What are your thoughts in the entirety of the global South?
Thank you so much, Bola, and thank you to Global Citizen and FPCI for the opportunity. It's truly an honor. I think I'll start off by saying, there are a few things that we do know. We know that there's a need for an overhaul of the international financial system. We know that this system continues to favor creditors, and we know that financing needs are extremely high. And so the global financial architecture reform topic is quite broad, and I have to say picking just 3 is a bit difficult. And a lot of the data I'm going to be mentioning refers more specifically to African countries, but the kinds of reforms that I'll talk about can really apply to other countries as well. But if I had to choose, I think the first one would be a reform of the IMF quota system. So the IMF has a quota system where countries are allocated quotas based on a quota formula that looks at different elements such as a country's economic size and how open a country's economy is. And these quotas are very important because they determine a country's voting power and how much financing they can receive from the IMF and how much they can commit. And I know special drawing rights has also been mentioned as well by a few speakers. And so just to give an idea, AU member states collectively possess about 5.2% of total IMF quotas, and 39 African countries represent less than 0.1% of overall IMF quotas. And then you contrast this with the United States that has 17% of total IMF quotas and continues to be the largest IMF shareholder. And so one of the ways that African countries can have access to more financing is to have more IMF quotas and for these shares to be redistributed more fairly. And at Development Reimagined, we've done extensive research looking at different scenarios for how those quotas can be redistributed in Africa's favor. And just to give an example, in one of the scenarios we looked at if quotas of G21 countries, and I say G21 because the African Union joined this time last year, if those quotas were to be redistributed equally amongst African countries, what that would look like. And our analysis showed that that would double Africa's quota share, which means that the continent has double the access to IMF financing. And so this small shift has the potential to really double financing and unlock billions of dollars for the continent. And the second reform is around credit rating agencies. So African governments need to mobilize funding, particularly from the private sector. And this is even more important now as we've been seeing decreases in concessional financing and ODA over the last few years. And these credit rating agencies, they hold a significant amount of power and influence over the cost of private borrowing. And these ratings really signal what that cost of borrowing should be and that risk of investing in a country. And if a country is given a lower credit rating, it means that they will have to pay higher interest. And we also saw a recent report by UNECA that showed that these credit rating agencies have had significant judgment errors in their assessments, and governments are the ones that have to bear the cost of that. And so if we were to go from a macro to a more micro level, if governments are borrowing at very expensive rates on international markets, and then commercial banks are having to borrow from the government, which is also very expensive, and then we're seeing SMEs and businesses also having to borrow from these banks, what ends up happening is people are getting locked out of financial markets. And so this need for a reform of these agencies for them to be more accountable, more transparent, is absolutely necessary. The African Union and the African Peer Review Mechanism are doing fantastic work on this. The African Credit Rating Agency is expected to be launched by the end of this year, and this has the potential to shift that narrative and ensure that there are more fair and objective ratings, and so that countries can be able to access more financing and again unlock billions more of financing for their countries. And the third reform.
Right. I think that we just have about a minute, so if you can wrap it up as you talk about the practical measures as well. Thank you.
Yeah. Yes. And third and last point, just very quickly, and I know this has already been mentioned, is an increase in concessional financing. I'm thinking specifically here on IDA, which is the concessional arm of the World Bank, and the ADF. And you also mentioned about African financial institutions. ADF, which is the concessional arm of the African Development Bank, is due for replenishment next year. And so one of the ways is for there to be more donor contributions going into ADF, as well as IDA, which is also due for replenishment at the end of this year. Thanks, Bola.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Etina Gash Kebret. Great insights there. And it's now time for us to invite our discussants. And I'll start off with the Managing Executive Officer of the Global Head of Equity Finance Group at Japan Bank for International Corporation. Yasuaki Yoniyama is our next guest. So take it away, Yasuaki. Hello, are you with us, Yasuaki? We want to have your response and then a question.
I'm sorry, I had some minor technical issues. Can you hear me now? Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Moderator, and thank you very much for the organizer for inviting me to this prestigious meeting. I'm very happy that I can be part of this discussion. I've been listening carefully to the interventions by the 5 speakers, and what I noticed is that now I think there is a strong consensus that we need a bold set of strong reforms of the multilateral development banks and the international financial architecture. While at the same time, I also hear people saying that we need to think about wisely about the political context, or like the political economy, because if we want to have the reforms actually be put in place, those reforms has to have the support of the politicians and ultimately the taxpayers of all the countries in the world. This brings me to ask a specific set of questions to the five speakers and also maybe the moderator. Yes, there are a bunch of proposals for reforming the multilateral development system, as well as the international financial architecture, including the IMF and the regional development banks. Much has been talked, discussed, proposed, but I don't think that much has been achieved so far. So my question is, how can we really bring forward this important agenda of reforming the international financial architecture, particularly the MDBs, that should be playing the central part of bringing, the scarce resources for the benefit of developing economies, particularly there's low-income countries where there is a strong need for concessional resources. And a related question to that is there's a concrete proposal set forward by the World Bank, President Ajay Banga. He has been pushing for a reform, not just of the World Bank, but of the multilateral development banking system. And some reforms have been put in place. What are your views? What's your take of those reforms put forward by the World Bank? How do you evaluate? How do you assess the nature of the reforms, and how do you see? Are you satisfied with the pace with which those reforms have been put in place? Are you not satisfied? Do you have any other suggestions to make those reforms more
possible? I think that the Isuaki is about action, and we want our speakers, any of our speakers, to pick up this. Thank you very much, Isuaki.
Thank you.
Maybe I can come in. I mean, I think the scale of the challenge is so great. I mean, we need to mobilize $3 trillion a year for the Sustainable Development Goals and the energy transition in emerging economies, that, the progress that we're making is not nearly where it needs to be, but it is still significant. So at the One Campaign, we've been working with many other partners over the past 2 years on MDB reform, on SDR recycling, on a lot of these kind of quite technical issues. And they have unlocked, we calculated, about $250 billion in additional low-cost lending. And now that's not what we need for the scale of the challenge. It's also not nothing, it's pretty significant. So I think we should celebrate our successes and realize that even in a very challenging context, we can make progress, but we need more political energy and political capital across G21 countries, across the globe. And that's, again, to come back to my earlier point, that's where activists come in, because unless we have that grassroots demand for these changes, all of the technical ideas in the world are not going to be implemented.
Well said, David. And I can see the hand of Madame Marrero up. Yes.
Yes. Seconding what David just said and referring to the fact that this has to be a collaborative effort and bringing activists together with the decision makers. One of the things that is happening in the upcoming summits, as we know, there are a number of opportunities, let's say, where decisions can be taken in both the Summit of the Future, the fall meetings of the Bretton Woods institutions, the upcoming Financing for Development conference, where decisions can be taken, where commitments can be made, although I'm convinced that it is, we have to go beyond commitments. We have to go beyond pledges, and we have to go into the actual reforms and the actions. But I'm sure that many of you are aware that in preparation for the Summit of the Future, as a result of the civil society conference in May, there is a series of impact coalitions, what have been called impact coalitions, bringing civil society organizations together with leaders and policymakers and representatives from the intergovernmental organizations. And Club of Madrid is co-leading one of these impact coalitions, precisely the one on financing for development. And it is there that a lot of these discussions and a lot of these proposals are being discussed between activists and the policymakers. So there are spaces, and as David was saying, progress is being made. It's not all the progress that we need, but progress is made, and we do have to seize these opportunities to have these exchanges and open.
And season we will do. Thank you very much, Madam Awero. We want to move on to our next discussants, but then take action by making use of the QR code on your screen. It's right there on your screen, and let's all take action. It's beyond commitment, it's about action. So I'll move on to the board member of the African Young Leaders Foundation, AYLF, Ayomide Fashan Ola Pekum. So you most welcome, Ayo. And let's have your pointers, please.
All right, so it's actually been great listening to everyone, and I think that we've all aligned on the fact that, we need funding in Africa, we have the debt stress and all of that in the global south, amongst other things. And Etsy has also helped to identify like 2 points saying we need to improve the IMF quota system, Africans should also mobilize funding, amongst other things. However, in my own opinion, while financial aid is very critical, we've also seen that these funds don't always reach the marginalized communities due to governance issues and corruption, right? For instance, the Global South occupies the first 10 seats as the poorest countries in the world, with African countries taking 9 out of that 10 seats, right? According to IMF, just as at yesterday. So this just further buttresses my point that corruption being a clog in the wheel will still continue to hinder marginalized communities from maximally benefiting from the funding received from the global north. So my direct question, I would direct that to Etsy, would be, how can we even move from just simply receiving funds or the global north simply sending funds to truly decentralizing the value chain by investing in African-based or African-led solutions, local production particularly, and capacity building to ensure direct benefits from and empowerment for the marginalized community? Or in other words, just saying that what practical step can we take to foster partnership that would empower African institutions, the citizens, and the leaders to drive sustainable development from the grassroots level? So it's saying, instead of us looking up for development, can we bring development down to the global south? Thank you. So I'll just
Well, thank you. And before Etsy comes in, I would want to bring in Dr. Hazwan Haini, a researcher and head of economics and finance unit at the Center for Strategic and Policy Studies, CSPS. And then we'll come to your question, Ayo. But thank you very much for your response and question, after which Etsy will come in. So Dr. Hazwan Haini, let's hear you, after which we'll lump it together. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for the excellent presentations. Really enjoyed that. So just to re-emphasize and re-summarize a lot of the key points, there are a lot of current inequities and inadequacies. There's numerous discussions and proposals for reforms. Again, we know that the global architecture still remains skewed towards these developed nations, and representation matters. Now, I'm going to carry on from the previous discussant, again, on inclusivity. And I'm going to touch on something that David mentioned earlier. It's not necessarily a direct question to David, but to everyone else as well on the panel, on advocating for change. So in Brunei, for some context, we look at a lot on financial literacy. When you advocate change, it has to be at the grassroots level. We can reform policies at the macro level, but financial literacy encompasses a range of skills and not about personal finances, but also the broader economic context, right? So a lot of these developing nations, they continue to grapple with these high debt levels and have limited access to financial resources. So equipping these citizens with more financial knowledge can somewhat foster resilience. It can enable them to navigate economic challenges, but also lead to greater civic engagement. So when individuals understand the financial systems and how it impacts their lives, they're more likely to participate in discussions about reforms and hold institutions accountable. So the questions, perhaps to David and other panelists, should there be a more micro approach to these changes and reforms? What role do think tanks and civil organizations do in promoting these, say, financial inclusion policies? And another one is the issue of reform measurement, especially in relation to financial inclusion. A lot of these questions have been, or a lot of measures for financial inclusion have been driven by the Washington Consensus, where it's very output-based, the number of accounts someone has, whether they have loans. Should it be whether it actually improves someone's lives? Because not everyone who's included in a financial system actually benefits. As we can see, especially in this current state where, having more finances and debt repayments actually becomes very hurtful for many developing countries. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hazwan Haini. And I want quickly for Etsy to answer Ayo's question, and then I would want to then move to all our speakers, giving you 2 minutes to come through with your responses and submissions. Thank you.
Thank you, Bola, and thank you, Ayumid. Fantastic question. And in terms of, I think, how do we target marginalized groups? One sort of example that comes to mind and that we use at Development Reimagined as an inspiration for a concept that we had around the Borrowers Club, which is, borrowers coming together to secure financing from creditors and sort of, flipping sort of the orthodoxy, flipping the coin and sort of ensuring that borrowers sort of take the lead when it comes to what kind of financing they receive and what they do with that financing. And so the model of microfinance, the Grameen model of microfinance is what really comes to mind. So it was a model led by Muhammad Yunus in 1976. So previously, people who had not been able to take out loans because of lack of collateral or their predicted income really kept a lot of vulnerable groups out of the system, in particular women. And this model had essentially enabled people to come together and take out loans and make smaller sort of affordable payments together. And this is a system which has been replicated globally and allowed millions of people to access financing that they otherwise would have not been able to. And it's a model that I think can be replicated in many African countries, for instance, and it's a way to sort of go at a very macro level, enable people to have access to markets that they otherwise would have not have been able to. And I think also, you also mentioned African financial institutions. One of the things we always say is we always talk about sort of reform of the Bretton Woods institutions, which is good on its own, but at the same time, there's not enough conversation about how do we channel financing towards smaller African financial institutions like the African Development Bank, like African Export-Import Bank. And these institutions are very critical because they understand the needs on the ground. They understand where the needs are, how much financing is actually needed, and being able to actually hone into what the issues are in each country in itself has its own value. So I think that would also be another.
Well said. Thank you very much, Etsy. And I'm now moving on to Dr. Mohammed Basri for your remarks, and then you can now come in as well, Ronan. So let's hear from Dr. Mohammed Basri.
Well, thank you very much. Much have been discussed, but I'm humble in the political reality. Yeah, I like what Jean-Claude Juncker said. We all know what to do. We just don't know how to get re-elected after we've done it. And I agree with that. So that is why the political economy issue is very important. So my suggestion is probably we have to find the highest common denominator, and every country will agree to sit together. So under the geopolitical fragmentation, it is important to explore the possibility to work on the health issue, on the climate issue, create a success story. Once people feel the benefit of it, you gather the political support and you move to the more complex and difficult reform. Otherwise, leaders will not be interested to support this idea for the political reason. Why should I spend my political capital if my successor will take the benefit of it?
Great one there. And Ronald Palmer, if you may.
Yeah, so building on the last speaker, I definitely think that we have to make this real for people. It has to be politically real, politically salient, and I think Ayana say also put their fingers on this. People have to see real benefits, but they have to have real agency in this. And that if you like is easily said. How do you actually do it? Do you get and there is some portfolio of the microfinance route. There is much that can be done in terms of building groups of local expertise. We've been doing some work on agriculture in Africa, and there is a huge amount that can and indeed is being done with local communities that needs to be built up and built out so that you can improve their productivity, their access to energy, which improves the capacity for education, for getting staff to market, but also for giving people real options to stay in their home place if that is what they want and not have to go somewhere else because it's only somewhere else that the jobs are. I think that and so you're absolutely right. I think the ecosystem of regional, national, and even local public banks is so important in work that we have done with the African Development Bank, with IFAD and others. Just the knowledge, the energy, and the innovation that banks like that can have is formidable, and it would be wonderful to see that really build up, and I think that is so important. But the last thing I would say is that the big institutions need to think way beyond projects and to think how are they building up local ecosystems of industry, of expertise. You cannot just build a factory and imagine that a factory is going to suddenly resolve a community's development issues. You've got to think of the supply chains, you've got to think of the training, you've got to think of that whole ecosystem of an industry of knowledge that needs to be built in place. Thanks.
Indeed. Thank you very much. And clearly we're exploring, diverse perspectives. Critical minds are here, and I love the engagement as well. I want to go to the man who is talking about, activism, action, man of action. David, I want for you to have the final remarks before we're going through our closing remarks as well. So David, I'll come over to you now. Thank you.
Thanks, Paula. I mean, I really agree with Haswan on financial literacy. It's really a firm belief of mine that so much of the populism and disengagement with politics that we're seeing now is because the world feels out of control and people don't understand and don't feel agency over decisions that are impacting their lives. And if we can educate people and explain the issues clearly without any jargon, and then identify where decisions are being made, who's making them, and how people can use their voice to influence those decisions, it's a fundamentally empowering thing. But as we talked about through all of this session, it's also fundamentally necessary for us to get these important decisions over the line. So I would encourage everyone listening to go to one.org, join the One campaign, join Global Citizen, understand the issues, but then take action because your voice really matters.
Thank you very much. Indeed, our voice is key. So we need to do that. Beyond commitment is about action. And that's why we're urging you to take action by making use of the QR code on your screens now. Earlier, I mentioned that our speakers are some of the brightest minds that you can find on this planet. Leaders in their own fields, and they've exhibited that this morning. It's not just about listening in, it's about participating. So go out there, take action, be part of it, share your own thoughts, ask the questions, and of course, be part of shaping the global dialogue. To all our speakers and discussants, I'd like to say thank you very much for being part of the Global Town Hall. And to all our viewers and those who are listening from across the world, we say thank you. Let's continue to make it topical issues. Let's dive deep into geopolitical trends, and let's take the pressing global challenges and deal with them. Thank you very much and have a nice day. My name is Bolare from Ghana, and bye to all of you. Thank you.
Thank you, Bola, for moderating this session. And thank you, everyone, for watching the Global Town Hall session on moving global financial reform forward, make it work for the Global South. Ladies and gentlemen, we are now almost halfway through the 15-hour marathon discussion. Up next, we have the session on geopolitics titled Put on Your Seatbelt, Anticipating Greater Political Turbulence Ahead and Finding Ways to Calm the Storm. As it will begin in just a few minutes, please stay tuned.
Hello, global citizens. Greetings from Uganda. I am Terotich Emmanuel, a public policy student at GRIPS, Tokyo, Japan. Currently, global civic engagement faces the challenge of shrinking civic space in many countries, where protests are being faced with a lot of brutality. There is an urgent call to strengthen legal protections, utilize digital platforms to amplify their voices, encourage inclusive dialogue, and gather international solidarity and support for these civic movements. Let's focus on solutions to safeguard global civic engagement. Let's work together to fix this mess. Welcome to the Global Town Hall 2024.
Global Town Hall. My name is Goodness Abba and I'm studying at the University of Abuja in Nigeria. In today's messy world, it's easy to feel overwhelmed. But staying on course isn't about avoiding the chaos, it's about navigating through it. Every small action we take contributes to the larger solution, but we can't solve everything at once. With a focused effort, we can steer ourselves and our community towards a brighter future. Let's commit to actions that matter because our choices today will shape the world we want to see tomorrow.